Hello, I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of Insight's Public Lectures, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the latest of our virtual lecture series, Britain and Europe, An Unsettled History. I'll be back at the end of the lecture in about half an hour to field questions and comments from you. So if you'd like to ask anything of our speaker, you can put the comments and questions in the chat box on YouTube, or you can add it to our Twitter feed. Our handle is @InsightsNCL, and you can hashtag InsightsNCL. Our speaker this evening is a distinguished professor of history at Keele University, who's published widely in the field of contemporary British history, British foreign policy and government. And she achieved the very rare thing for an academic, certainly in history, of writing a book which had enormous appeal. Her most recent book, Our Boys, her book about the Falklands War, which interspersed archival research and oral testimony and became a bestseller and was reviewed everywhere, Start the Week, won a host of prizes, and demonstrates the region impact that thoughtful, inspired scholarship can have in the field of contemporary history. She's speaking to us this evening on perhaps the most eternal, chronic, divisive issue in British politics and public life, conceivably back to the Reformation, but certainly in our lifetimes. And that's why it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Helen Parr.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for tuning in to listen. I should say I was particularly pleased to be invited to give this lecture for Newcastle University, because I grew up in Newcastle, at least for my teenage years, as I'm sure you can tell by my accent. I attended Gosforth High School, and it was largely because of two brilliant history teachers there, Mr. Hodnett and Mrs. Fearon, that I ended up studying history at university. And then, of course, because of that, I did a PhD in contemporary British history, in which I researched Britain's relations with the European community in the 1960s. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank them for everything they did at school. Let's start with the title, An Unsettled History. You see here Edward Heath signing the Treaty of Rome to take Britain into the community in 1973, and Boris Johnson signing the withdrawal agreement in 2020 to take Britain out. The history of Britain's relations with European integration has been unsettled. It's been unsettled firstly because for all British prime ministers since Harold Macmillan in 1957, attempting to join the EEC and then being a member of the EEC and EU has caused what Chris Patten referred to as a psychodrama. It has sometimes been a psychodrama of British identity. The writer Michael Shanks, author of the 1962 bestseller The Stagnant Society, asked, what kind of island do we want to be? Britain's participation or otherwise in a supranational European grouping brought that question into sharp attention. Was Europe to be the focus for Britain's world role, for instance, following the end of empire? It's also been a psychodrama for British political parties. The question of Europe was one factor splitting the Labour Party in 1981, and Britain's membership or otherwise of the EC and EU has played a part in ending the careers of every single Conservative Prime Minister from Macmillan onwards, except perhaps Alec Douglas-Home. That is Macmillan himself, Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, David Cameron, Theresa May, until, of course, Boris Johnson. It hasn't ended his career yet. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, but it is now probably causing an existential crisis for the Labour Party. And it's also an unsettled history because this history is often told in a way that emphasises a single thread, a thread of British exceptionalism. In 1990, the political scientist Stephen George used the phrase an awkward partner to explain the differences that many observed between the attitudes of Britain towards a supranational Europe to the attitudes of France and Germany. And obviously, Britain's relationship to European integration was different. Britain did not succumb to Nazism, and it was not invaded during the Second World War. You can see here the celebrations following Victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May 1945. Furthermore, Britain can trace its unwritten constitution back centuries. Winston Churchill, after becoming Prime Minister in 1940, described the House of Commons as the shrine of the world's liberties. Britain prides itself on a constitution that is unbroken and that reacts and evolves. Ernest Bevin, Labour Foreign Secretary after 1945, when confronted with the first idea for a European coal and steel community in 1950 that would have a supranational institutional structure, he commented that Britain could never put the roof on before it had built the house. However, this sense of exceptionalism risks creating the impression that all roads led to departure, and that, I think, is wrong. Britain was a member of the European Community and the European Union for 47 years. In some ways, the Second World War, usually seen as a reason why Britain stood outside continental integration, was also one main factor propelling Britain in. Harold Macmillan had fought in the First World War and been injured at the Somme. He believed that division in Western Europe could prove fatal for Western civilization, the free world, as he put it. And he saw European unity, with Britain in it, as the only way to overcome that division. Edward Heath had been a Royal Artillery officer in Europe during the Second World War. He described in his memoirs touring a devastated Germany at the end of the war and later attending the Nuremberg trials. He understood, he said, that this must never be allowed to happen again, and that European integration was the way to prevent it. Britain's pro-Europeanism and Britain's Euroscepticism therefore sometimes had roots in similar episodes. They were differing responses to the same events, and thus they have to be understood together. That's why it's a psychodrama. And that brings us to the third way in which Britain's relations with European integration might be thought of as unsettled, in that it's not over. Britain is out of the European Union, that is certain, and it might never rejoin. Even if it eventually did, I think it would be on very different terms, and the EU itself obviously also may well change. But Britain's relations with the EU will have to evolve, and the European continent and the EU itself will continue to bear greatly on Britain's politics and place in the world. So what I'm going to talk about is the history of Britain's relations with the European Community and European Union, from attempting to join it to coming out today. And what I hope to show is that this has to be understood not as a singular history, but within the changing context of its times. And that, I think, will suggest just what a deep change departure will be. Let's turn first to the era of Britain's accession to the community, which starts in 1957 and takes us through the first and second applications for membership and the first referendum for membership on continued membership in 1975. You can see here already the sense that membership of a supranational European institution might cause a psychodrama for Britain's political parties. A 1961 cartoon in which Harold Macmillan says to the French President General de Gaulle, "Mon général, we have discarded our two-party system and got lots of new political parties, like France." I'll start this section with a quote from Britain's former Foreign and Defence Secretary and Labour Party parliamentarian Denis Healey, who was reporting a conversation he had had with Sir Richard Turnbull, the penultimate governor of Arden. He, Sir Richard Turnbull, told me that when the British Empire finally sank below the waves of history, it would leave behind only two monuments. One was the game of association football, and the other was the expression, "fuck off." I expect we might now think that the British Empire has left more legacy than this on the metropole. But the point is that these initial moves towards the European community took place against a backdrop of acute awareness of the end of empire. In some ways, that might sound strange. The pace of decolonisation accelerated after the 1956 Suez Crisis. But the end of empire never occasioned the Houses of Parliament the kind of psychodrama that we've come to associate with Britain's membership of the European Community. Pro-empire conservatives knew that the time for the end of empire had arrived. Enoch Powell, who wrote of the pain he felt when Britain gave up India, said in 1961 that the imperial phase was over, so plainly ended that even the generation born at its zenith no longer deceived themselves as to that fact. In fact, in the 1960s, Powell favoured moving into Europe as an expression of the scaled down role he believed Britain should now play in international politics. Labour, for its part, had long supported a multiracial Commonwealth, a body that was now becoming a reality. There was, however, in this period, widespread commentary about Britain's relative decline, so-called descent from power, and widespread anxiety that Britain's economic productivity did not match that of the European powers, who were, from 1957, integrated into a nascent customs union. The sociologist Michael Young captured something of that feeling of a drab Britain lagging behind a dynamic Western Europe with the title of his 1960 essay, The Chipped White Cups of Dover. So if we had to ask why Britain tried to join the European community in the 1960s, the reasons are, in some respects, quite simple. It was not because Britain had become defeatist about its future prospects. Rather, it resulted from a realistic assessment of a changed world and a changed Britain. The 6 countries of France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg had successfully created an economic community, but that economic community had political implications. Its rapid rates of economic growth put a spotlight on why Britain could not achieve the same. Perhaps more importantly, though, the British government assessed that this large, successful grouping in continental Europe would weaken Britain's influence in the Cold War world. The Americans supported European integration and would likely come to speak first to the European community and sidestep Britain. With Britain outside, West German power could grow too large. It would be like giving them on a plate what we fought 2 world wars to prevent, as Harold Macmillan said. Macmillan saw membership of the European community as a way to harness a modernising spirit in Britain. The British economy could be galvanised through the cold douche of competition. He also saw it as a means to rally the Conservative Party and the country as empire ended. In his first speech to the 1922 committee, he told them, "The greatest moments in our history have not been when we have conquered, but when we have led." And that idea that Britain should assume leadership in Western Europe remained the driving force of conservative pro-Europeanism, at least during the Cold War. Of course, Britain did not succeed in getting into the European community while Harold Macmillan was in charge. Britain applied for membership in 1961 to see if the conditions existed under which Britain could accede. Those conditions were mainly to do with allowing access for agricultural products grown in the old Commonwealth into the common external tariff of the EEC. You can see here on the cartoon, Macmillan trying to smuggle Commonwealth trade into that common external tariff. After 16 months of negotiations, the French President General de Gaulle terminated the negotiations without result, saying that Britain could not enter the European community because England was insular and maritime and linked through exchanges, markets and supply lines to the most diverse and often, he said, the most distant countries. Harold Macmillan recognised this as the failure it was of his strategy of modernisation. He recorded in his diary, "All our policies at home and abroad are in ruins." The Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson's application for membership of the EEC in 1967 has received a lot less public attention, largely because commentators at the time were not sure whether he was serious about getting in. This front cover of Private Eye in 1967 illustrates that sense of unreality. It shows the imposing figure of President de Gaulle, apparently certain to veto more, and it pictures the Foreign Secretary, George Brown, singing a nursery rhyme. Brown had grown up in poverty, but rose to hold high office. He'd always been a passionate supporter of Britain's entry into the European community. He also often became, as they say, tired and emotional, as you can see from Wilson's comment, Georges est un peu fatigué, votre majesté. Note also the perceived supplication to the president. Wilson did not initially, when he became Prime Minister in 1964, intend to apply for membership of the EEC. Like many with background on the Labour left, he saw the EEC as a conservative, Catholic and protectionist bloc, and he preferred to regenerate Commonwealth ties. He also advocated economic planning, meeting the problem of Britain's sluggish economic growth by creating a French-style national plan. But by 1966, Wilson's government was in trouble. Like Macmillan, Wilson had tried, perhaps to use a modern phrase, to have his cake and eat it, sustaining Britain's global commitments by maintaining the value of the pound and keeping Britain's military bases in Southeast Asia. In the summer of 1966, with sterling under pressure, the government resisted devaluation of the pound and imposed instead a strict deflation, putting an end to growth targets under the national plan and cutting defence expenditure, effectively ending Britain's defence role in the Far East. Those changes pushed Britain towards the European community to attract investment, to encourage growth, and to preserve Britain's international role. Wilson was not, like Macmillan or Heath, an enthusiastic supporter of Britain's membership of the EEC. He didn't try to re-articulate Britain as a European power. But what he did, and I think it's an important point, was to advocate that through Europe, Britain could retain its influence and its international standing. To make this point further, let's look at the decision to apply for membership made by Wilson's cabinet in April 1967. They discussed possible alternatives to membership of the European community. One argument was that Britain could go it alone. Some in the Labour Party liked this idea. Britain could become, it was suggested, a socialist offshore island, withdrawing from its world role and concentrating on the provision of welfare at home. However, it was countered. Going it alone was unappealing. It might be technically possible, but it would rapidly reduce Britain to a posture of international neutrality, a greater Sweden, as they said. They regarded this as undesirable. The cabinet secretary said, in form, we might be more free outside, but it would be a freedom to submit to disagreeable necessities. They discussed leading the Commonwealth. However, the point was made that the Commonwealth was not very keen on being led. Ian Smith's government in Southern Rhodesia had recently unilaterally declared its independence to preserve its white majority rule. Wilson's government did not support Smith's regime, but they could do little about it, and the Zambian foreign minister had called Wilson a racialist at the Commonwealth ministers' meeting in 1966. Or Britain could partner up with the United States in a North Atlantic free trade area. However, NAFTA was also unappealing because it would expose Britain's weakness. Britain could become a 51st state. In 1967, such a subordinate position, the Prime Minister indicated, could force Britain to follow the Americans into Vietnam. In those circumstances, membership of the European community was the best alternative. Only through membership could Britain preserve its independence and influence in world affairs. Wilson did not, of course, succeed in taking Britain into the EEC. That was left for Edward Heath in 1973. Nevertheless, bringing Labour to support it in 1967 altered the centre ground. It created a reluctant opinion that the alternatives were worse, and that was a view held by both main political parties in power for almost the next half century. So let's look then at the 1970s as the implications of community membership for Britain's political parties, particularly for the Labour Party, became clearer. After Labour lost the general election in 1970, the left of the party began to express opposition to entry into the EEC. That was largely because they felt disillusioned by Wilson's government, and they viewed community membership as an impediment to a left-wing programme. Eric Heffer, formerly a supporter of membership, explained, "The issue we are faced with is basically the issue of how best do we get socialism." As Wilson began to express his own opposition to the terms under which Britain would enter the community, many Labour pro-Europeans felt in turn that it was wrong to go back on what they had agreed in government. Consequently, against a three-line whip, 69 Labour MPs voted with the Conservatives to ensure the passage of the European Communities Bill passed through Parliament. Roy Hattersley said, "I had no doubt that I had been right to vote for Europe, but I felt all the joy of a police informer who had turned Queen's evidence against his own family." In 1972, Wilson adopted the policy that Labour would renegotiate the terms of entry and hold a referendum on continued membership. He did so to keep the Labour Party together, a life raft into which the whole party might one day have to climb, as James Callaghan put it, and as you can see from the cartoon. The 1975 referendum returned an emphatic victory for Wilson and for staying in the common market. 67% of the turnout voted to stay in, and in almost a reverse of the electoral geography of 2016, the areas of highest support were in the home counties and in England, and the only areas that voted no were Shetland and the Western Isles in Scotland. So what explained why the 1975 referendum returned such strong support for a yes vote? Firstly, perhaps the position of Harold Wilson himself. He was not a conviction politician. It meant that he could make the argument that although he did not love Europe, he had weighed up the options and he recommended it as the best choice. But that argument worked because Wilson could rely on heavyweight pro-European members of his cabinet and government who made a positive case for membership. Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams, for example, argued that Europe was the best new home for Britain after empire. They regarded cooperation in Europe as the best way to deal with international problems like environmental change. And like Edward Heath, they believed that European integration was the alternative to the nationalism that had led to such violent destruction in 2 European wars. Secondly, the centre ground of British politics and nearly all the British press, importantly, favoured staying in. Margaret Thatcher, the new leader of the Conservative Party, was enthusiastic in her support. There she is, wearing a pro-European jumper, galvanising female support. Europe or bust, as one of the t-shirts charmingly says. Thirdly, and related, in 1975, the opponents of membership could be seen as on the fringes of British politics. Socialist and founder member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Michael Foot, was on the same side as Enoch Powell, who was rumoured to get down on his knees in church and thank God for capitalism. Powell believed that laying down your life for your country was the highest form of honour, and he'd been removed from the Conservative shadow cabinet after his 1968 anti-immigration Rivers of Blood speech. With them was Ian Paisley, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, who believed that the European project ranked with sodomy and ecumenism as a menace to the survival of Protestant Ulster. They all believed that Britain should not surrender sovereignty in a European community, but other than that, the anti-marketeers had little in common. They were depicted as oddballs, as perhaps you can see in the cartoon, and therefore leaving the common market could be seen as politically dangerous. Furthermore, as Robert Saunders shows in his excellent book, Yes to Europe, the 1970s were a politically divided time. In the early 1970s, the government had worried that striking miners could bring the country to a halt. Edward Heath declared 5 states of emergency between 1970 and 1974. After the oil crisis in 1973, inflation was at nearly 25%. People were told to stay at home for 2 working days a week to conserve fuel. Lights went out in the evening. What this meant was that recent knowledge of political and economic upheaval meant that leaving the EEC was probably a risk that people didn't want to take. What's more, people could remember the war. It was 1975. The war had only finished 30 years previously, and the First World War was still a living memory. The politicians who spoke about overcoming nationalism therefore talked to an audience who understood, as this campaign poster shows. That message, better lose a little national sovereignty than a son or a daughter, surely still hit home in 1975. This sense of losing an empire and trying to find a role, therefore, was one backdrop to debates about Britain's relations with Europe in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the early 1980s. The Conservative Party was still the party of Europe, and the Labour Party were more sceptical. The referendum had aimed to keep the Labour Party together, but in 1981, Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers, and David Owen left to create the Social Democratic Party. From the mid to late 1980s, political parties' relations to European integration changed. After electoral defeat in 1983, the Labour Party began to bring itself to support Britain's place in Europe, which it now saw as the best way to control or to mitigate international capitalism. By 1997, Tony Blair, seen here in Amsterdam taking a bike ride with other men of Europe, wanted to position Britain as at the heart of Europe. At that time, commentators even regarded the independence of the Bank of England as a potential precursor to Britain joining the euro. Pro-Europeanism, therefore, became firmly associated not so much with moderate conservatism, but with the centre-left. The Conservative Party, for its part, moved away from its previous pro-Europeanism. In 1986, when Margaret Thatcher signed the Single European Act, she still twinned an admittedly more muted support for British political leadership in Europe with her strong advocacy of the extension of market liberalism across Europe. But in her speech to the College of Europe at Bruges in 1988, pictured here at the top, she began to show greater hesitation with the future direction that the European community, as it still was, might take. Her Bruges speech was still largely a pro-European one. Speaking of the dangers of division in a Cold War world, she said, "Britain does not dream of some cosy, isolated existence on the fringes of the European community. Our destiny is in Europe as part of the community." But she also said, "We have not rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain only to have them reimposed at European level with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels." Nevertheless, the Conservative Party still adhered to British membership of the EC and then the EU. Euroscepticism was a fringe position in the party in the 1990s. In 1992, during debates on the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty, shown there at the top, John Major called his Eurosceptic colleagues the dispossessed and the never possessed. The reach of Euroscepticism did increase, particularly perhaps after the 2008 crash, but David Cameron might be described as a moderate Eurosceptic who believed that the best course for Britain was to stay in the EU. A Euroscepticism that advocated withdrawal from the EU was a minority position in the Conservative Parliamentary Party until the result of the referendum was in. So, the referendum. David Cameron endorsed an in-out referendum on Britain's continued membership of the EU while he was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats in 2013. This cartoon is from The Economist when that pledge was first announced. He did so because of political pressure, largely from outside the Conservative Party and particularly from the UK Independence Party. Nigel Farage's breakthrough was to connect the question of immigration with the question of EU membership. Nobody had made that explicit link previously, and it proved more popular than the question of rising food prices had done in 1975. Farage himself said that the issue of immigration moved Euroscepticism from intellectual debates to things that were affecting everyday lives. Cameron opted to hold a referendum to silence the Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party and to head off the electoral threat from UKIP. He believed that following the 1975 referendum and the more recent referenda on the alternative vote and on Scottish independence, that voters would opt for the status quo and that Remain, a very 2016 word, would win. It didn't. Why was that? There's been an awful lot of work on that issue, but suffice to say here, I don't think that it was inevitable that Leave would win. All roads did not necessarily lead to departure. The result was close, much closer than 1975 had been. So let's point here to some of the background factors that might help to explain the victory for Leave. The timing of the referendum perhaps turned out not to favour Remain. The Eurozone crisis, which also gave a popular purchase to Euroscepticism, was fresh in people's minds. The migrant crisis was ongoing. The Labour Party leadership supported Remain, but Jeremy Corbyn's heart was probably with the left-wing Eurosceptics of the 1970s. Cameron, like Wilson had done, tried to strike a note of detached ambivalence in favour of staying in. But unlike Wilson, he didn't have a convincing, popular, pro-European foil who made a resonant case in favour. The fading memory of the Second World War probably meant that people tended to see the EU less as a peace project, better lose a little sovereignty than a son or a daughter, and more as part of the problems of remote government removed from the daily concerns of people's lives. If people thought at all about a backdrop of war, they probably thought about Iraq, involvement in which had seriously undermined centre-left internationalism and the pro-Europeanism that went with it, and that had contributed to a growing distrust of politicians. But perhaps also the referendum was won and lost during the campaign. The Remain campaign lacked a clear and positive message, relying on the assumption that voters would want to steady the ship and would not want to take the risk of departure. Leave, on the other hand, ran a very strong campaign, united around the issue of sovereignty under the slogan, "Take back control." In conclusion then, let's return to the unsettled history. Britain's relations with European integration have been a psychodrama for Britain's political parties. Europe was one issue splitting the Labour Party in 1981, and it has forced the Conservative Party to reinvent itself. It's compelling Labour now to do the same, although we don't quite yet know how. But the irony is that Britain's membership of the EC and EU has only ever been the driving political focus for a small number of politicians. The Roy Jenkinses and the Bill Cashes, who gave a strong, principled, consistent attention to Britain's membership of the EC and EU, were in a minority in both parties. Some research into the Conservative Party in 2010, for instance, showed that about 10% of MPs were Europhiles and 11% were withdrawalists. Almost half were, like the leadership, moderately Eurosceptic, but favoured staying in, and 9% were entirely agnostic. They had no view at all. Most MPs, therefore, have been pragmatic, and their positions have changed with the changing times. That suggests, I think, that Britain will adapt to departure, but it also suggests that the psychodrama might not be over. Turning now to the always in the unsettled history, the sense that Britain's relations with European integration reflected a hardwired exceptionalism, and that therefore departure was an expression of something deep or innate in Britain's politics. Obviously, Britain's relationship to Europe was different to that of other countries, but Britain was a member for 47 years. It has an integrationist as well as an awkward heritage. Britain's exit from Europe was contingent on the circumstances in 2016. It might not have happened, or it might not have happened then and in that way. However, if we turn to the future, there is no doubt that Britain's decision to leave the EU is a deep change, an incision, as Peter Hennessy has put it. It reveals a fundamental break in Britain's understanding of how best to make its way in world politics. As Britain has retreated from empire and re-articulated its role in world politics, it has always sought to maximise its influence. During the period of its EC and EU membership, Britain's belief was that influence should be extended through interdependence. Now, it maintains that influence is best gained by privileging its sovereignty. Britain is now refashioning itself as global Britain. That's sometimes seen as an inheritor of empire, from empire to Europe and back again. And while it might have elements of that, it is also a statement of Britain's posture in a changed world order, in which its proponents expect Europe might count for less and Britain can remake itself as enterprising, dynamic, outward-looking and sovereign. Perhaps more than anything else, therefore, the 2016 referendum illustrates a change in the way that politics in Britain is being conducted. It was the end of an era in which both political parties held that British influence should be articulated through participation in a supranational European grouping, to one in which it is understood that its sovereignty is best asserted from the centre, first to its people, and now to the EU and the world, and best exercised from outside of supranational entanglement with its European partners. And it will take many years for the implications of that change fully to become clear. Thank you very much for your attention.
And here we are live with local girl Helen Parr. Helen, welcome to Insights.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you here, obviously better in person, but lovely to have you here in a virtual form. And that was a remarkably clear and concise survey of Britain's unsettled history of Europe. And to start with a sort of a mildly, not provocative question, but essentially, was de Gaulle right? We would never be good Europeans. We would always think of the Atlantic as being narrower than the Channel, and his hunch was essentially the right one.
I would disagree, I think, for the reasons that I hope I expressed. That is one element in Britain's history, but it's not the only one. And de Gaulle had particular reasons for keeping Britain out of the European community in the 1960s, particularly perhaps because he settled upon European integration as the way to kind of remake France's international image after the Second World War, and also to kind of to position France as a great power. And de Gaulle talked very eloquently about la grandeur of France. So he had reasons to keep Britain out in the 1960s, not just political reasons, but economic reasons too. But I think his reading of Britain as insular and maritime and inevitably Atlantic It's partly a Cold War reading, but it's a singular reading. It underplays the extent that once Britain was in, it did play a constructive role in the European community and then the European Union until the point at which it withdrew.
The curious thing is with our history and then with the referendum is that it was never a particularly important issue for voters throughout our membership, but also it was never a particularly popular issue. It was kind of a latent thing, wasn't it? And then it became a public concern when the possibility of a referendum became more pronounced in the last 10 years or so.
Yes, I think that's right. So and that's exactly as you've just put it. It was never terribly popular. It was never particularly high salience. Public opinion tended to follow the lead of political leaders. That was something which was observed in the 1960s and 1970s, and it was observed again, leading up to the referendum. So it became high salience because of the political debate about whether or not Britain should continue its membership. I think that's right.
And also the erosion of trust or belief in leaders and in established authority. So in 75, people were prepared to accept the wisdom of their leaders. And as you pointed out, those who were opposed to membership were on the fringes of their parties. But in 2016, even when someone as popular as Obama entered the debate and said it was in Britain's and America's interests to retain membership, it backfired because it sounded like he was talking down to people.
I know. And I think that if, it's hard to say that there was one major change, but if there is one major change between 1975 and 2016, it is probably that the relationship between political leaders and the population had changed. You might see that as being the end of deference. You might see it as being a kind of, an age in which political communications have been transformed because of new technology. But I think that it's that kind of the way in which the message of political leadership would play with the population that is perhaps one of the things that David Cameron kind of really didn't sufficiently factor into his calculation when he decided to have a referendum in when he took that decision. It was 2013.
In the Eurozone crisis, there'd been the expensive scandal, there'd been Iraq, there'd been the crash here. It wasn't a good period for established authority. And this is a very good point. Questions coming in now from our audience. Christopher asks, why do you think the press that overwhelmingly supported membership in 75 became increasingly eurosceptic?
Well, that is a very good question. And that is, and also in some ways, that is the question to ask. Why did the press become more eurosceptic? The ownership of the press changed. It must have perceived, or certain sort of press leaders must have perceived that Euroscepticism was something which helped them to sell papers. They probably also positioned it as being, again, this anti-politics argument that you've just outlined, being something with which they could kind of bash the political leadership with. In the more tabloid press, the sort of, the 2 world wars and 1 World Cup narrative was often something which played very well. That's probably something that became much more pronounced. I hesitate to put dates on it, but maybe from the Falklands War onwards, maybe from 1982 onwards, sort of arguments about Britain being better than the European countries and certainly different to the European countries became more widespread. And then, in the more sort of immediate history, that connection that Nigel Farage made between EU membership and immigration, which I think, in some ways it's a stroke of genius on Farage's part to make that link. And it did change the way in which EU membership entered into the political debate.
It's always very hard to impute consequences of what press says, but to extend Christopher's question, do you think it mattered?
I think it mattered enormously. It's interesting that the press was pro-European or on the side of staying in 1975. The Daily Express, after the 1975 referendum, the Daily Express said that the best lesson of the referendum was that the centre held. It said, we are a sensible kingdom. And that kind of, that had transformed by 2016, isn't it? It would be inconceivable that the tabloid would have said something along those lines in 2016. So I think it's enormously important. It all kind of, making the kind of the background political weather, during the sort of, even during kind of the high peak of Labour pro-Europeanism in the Blair years, I think it was said that Rupert Murdoch's presence was never directly heard, but always felt. So, it kind of helps to establish the parameters within which the political debate takes place.
The Express, of course, was the first newspaper to call on us leaving, I think, in 2000, and very prominent in using the White Cliffs of Dover and all these motifs of separateness and echoing the war and so on. And that leads me into a question from Susan, which is drawing on something which occurred to me in the lecture, which is we keep saying Britain. But much of the debate can be presented as being English nationalistic or an English debate. And Susan asked the question, what might be the consequences of a separate Scotland rejoining the EU?
Well, I mean, that is a question, isn't it? This is one of the great unspokens, or it's not really unspoken, is it? It's one of the great paradoxes about Britain pulling out of the EU. It is in that it's this assertion of British sovereignty, but that puts a real spotlight on the question of Scottish independence. The figures are pretty stark. I think it's 68% in Scotland voted to, or 65% in Scotland voted to stay in, 38% to leave. So it's very different to the figures in England. So the immediate consequences, I think, of the referendum result were or have been an increase of support for Scottish nationalism, based upon the premise that that Scottish nationalism would be a better route to the kind of internationalism that EU membership used to express. So it has, in the short term, given a boost to the cause of Scottish independence, I think. What we don't know is how that is going to continue, how that is going to play out, whether that boost is going to stay, or whether the sort of unionists in England will start to make a more articulate case for the preservation of the Union, of the United Kingdom. So, I think unionism, the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party, but it often takes that unionism for granted. But the sort of the prospect of the heightened popularity of Scottish nationalism may well force them to be more articulate about the United Kingdom. Whether that works or not is, of course, another question. So, if in the future Scotland does become independent, if then an independent Scotland can find a way to rejoin the EU, then where would that leave England, or England and Wales? It's a terribly important question. The idea that there might be a hard border, not so very far north from where you all are, it's not something that I guess many of us imagined that we would ever see when, even a few years ago. So it's a very, very serious question, and leaving the EU does raise that question, but we don't know how it's going to play out.
It's curious how the appeal for Scottish nationalists, the appeal of leaving the UK and rejoining the EU has been made greater by Brexit, but the practicality has been made much worse, much harder.
Well, yes, in some ways. I mean, that's certainly what the sort of the conservative eurosceptics or the conservative unionists would say, that Brexit has made it harder for Scotland to leave because of the economics of it. I think largely because of the economics of it. But it's, again, perhaps something of a paradox that they would point to those arguments, whereas they weren't the arguments that they pointed to when they talked about Brexit. So, the case for Remain was largely made around the economic case for staying in the EU, which the Brexiteers didn't think was...
Yes, that could be a heart matter. You mentioned the Conservative Unionist Party. Were you surprised, or how surprised were you with the polling or the research that was conducted, which revealed that most Conservative Party members or prioritise the sundering of the Union with the EU over the retaining of the Union between England and Scotland?
That is quite a surprising finding, but I guess what we don't know is exactly what they think that means, whether that would change. I mean, it wouldn't change in the sense that I don't think people would want to go back on Brexit. But then going back on Brexit isn't likely, even in the context of Scottish independence. So, yeah, who knows how it's going to play out.
One concern that does arise, and this comes into question from Keith, we have had the Defence Review yesterday, and this is very popular in Scotland with the increase of warheads for the nuclear deterrent. It's very unpopular in Scotland, wants to be a nuclear-free nation. There'll be huge implications for UK defence for Scotland to leave the Union. Keith asked a broader question about NATO. Could you comment on NATO, especially with the changes in international aid and the nuclear ceiling?
Yeah, and we were talking about the Defence Review just earlier, and the sort of the enormous implications that this may well have for Britain's future foreign and defence policy. So it's interesting, isn't it? There does seem to be an awful lot of kind of revaluing of Britain's world role going on at the moment, as we might expect. I suppose that the sort of the assumptions of Britain's foreign and defence policy have, in a sense, been kind of overturned with this kind of assumption that Britain's influence comes best through interdependence. So now, how does Britain kind of continue to exercise its influence, and what does it want to do with that influence now that Britain is outside of the EU? And those questions are kind of coming into quite sharp relief in a way, aren't they? What the Defence Review does, as we were talking before, it doesn't really mention Europe that much. And that's a huge change. The idea that Britain's foreign and defence policy can be fundamentally made just by bypassing the EU or not really taking account of the EU is something which, the whole of the 20th century really, I suppose, has been guided by Britain's, by the proximity of the continent and by events on the continent kind of shaping what Britain does. So whether Britain is going to be able to have this kind of global British strategy that doesn't look at first at Europe, I don't know. The same question will arise in NATO. Sort of how does Britain best articulate its influence through NATO? Is it through an increase of its nuclear arsenal? Again, I don't know. That's a change. It's a change in the direction of foreign defence policy. It might feel that, Britain's influence now better comes through this kind of hard military power, while simultaneously cutting the quantity of its armed services to levels that are really rather low.
Perhaps the most alarming thing was lowering the threshold for first use, which was an extraordinary thing to include in a defence review. The other thing that Keith mentioned, just if you could draw on this bit, because you pointed out the increase in spending on nuclear weapons, of course, has been the cut in aid. Do you have any reflections on Britain as a soft power, superpower, and how that fits with cutting the aid budget?
Yes, and I think it's quite interesting that this is the one thing, well, this is one of the main things where there has been quite a lot of pushback even from within the Conservative Party. And I think that the promise is that they will review that decision at a later date. So it seems that even, in the Conservative Party and even amongst the government, there is an acknowledgement that this may well not be good for Britain's soft power. So I guess we'll have to watch the space on that one and see whether they do decide to revoke the reduction or to increase the aid budget again. But certainly, I mean, that's a break, isn't it? And it's an indication again of the sort of the ways in which Britain has chosen to influence throughout most of the post 1945 period being called into question. That wasn't inevitable with Brexit. Didn't make that inevitable. that there's still choices to be made about how Britain engages with the world after Brexit.
In a curious way, and I know it was always very unpopular, particularly unpopular and sensitive issue, was defence and security cooperation with Europe when we were in the EU. Now we've left, in a curious way, is cooperation with Europe and in particular France and Germany and the E3. Is that more likely? Is that more feasible as an internationalist activity for the UK to engage in than it could do when it was in the EU?
Well, I suppose it might be. I mean, it's quite interesting that that's one thing that wasn't part of the withdrawal agreement. So it's been left unstated exactly what the new relationship might be. But I don't know if the sort of, the hesitations that Britain had about closer cooperation with the European powers are probably still present. Probably the sort of high peak of political foreign defence cooperation with the EU is again in that sort of early Tony Blair period, but that was rather undermined by the Iraq War. So I don't know. I mean, if you wanted to be the optimists, may well see this as an opportunity to kind of to refashion defence relations with France and Germany in ways that might better suit Britain's interests. Whether that will happen or not, there aren't really any signs yet, I don't think.
No, there is some. It's only been 3 months since we've left. What's been the evidence so far, albeit under these extraordinary circumstances, of the nature of our relations with the EU and the language that's being used by our leading politicians?
No. So I think the big issue, so to speak, is whether the disruption to trade and the increased bureaucratic burden that leaving the single market has placed upon businesses, whether these are, to use the phrase that's being used, teething issues, or whether that will reflect a permanent problem. So I think there's a very big economic question there about what this will mean for Britain's for Britain's trade, therefore for Britain's economy, with the EU and also globally. I suppose we might think that those trading issues that have been there, but perhaps haven't been commented on that much, whether they persist, how that plays out in the slightly longer term. And then, we've kind of been in this very curious period where politically in Britain, everything, as you all know, in the last few months has been dominated by COVID. That's been longer than the last few months. In the last few months, it's been dominated by the issue of the vaccine, where the government has been able to sort of, to contrast its experience very favourably with what's happening in the EU. So whether or not Britain would have been able to do what it's done with the vaccines had it still been a member of the EU, I suspect it probably would have done, but we don't know. But it certainly has managed to kind of to augment this narrative about look what we can do now that we're not a member of the EU. The EU, for its part, has said some fairly unsavoury things about trading restrictions, export bans, all the rest of it. Although that seems to be sort of quietening down. But that enabled Britain to kind of present itself as being the grown-up partner in a way. But I hope and I suspect that those things will probably, hopefully, will calm as we kind of, again, hopefully come out of this period which has been defined by COVID.
There's been too much to process or to take in the last few years, of which this has been part of it. It's hard to imagine now that this time last year or just before December 2019, I wasn't imagining anything could be bigger in public life than the parliamentary meltdown and the parties being riven by this issue. And then lo and behold, the following year, something much bigger came along. The last question, actually, was the second question to arrive, but I've been holding it back because it's a very good one. It's been put on the spot, I'm afraid. It's from Bert, who asks, since the EU evolved into something that was not advantageous to the UK, was it not better that the UK left the EU?
Well, we don't know, I think, is the answer to that question. So I think that the issue is this, it really is a deep change, and I really do want to emphasize what a deep change it is to leave the EU. And that is because of this shift from thinking in terms of Britain's influence being exercised through interdependence, through entanglement in a supranational organisation with its partners in Europe, into something where Britain's influence is exercised in a different way. So we can't answer that question yet. We don't know whether it's going to be advantageous or not, because we don't know the extent to which the judgments that they made in the 1960s and the 1970s reflect an objective reality, or reflected, or even if they did reflect an objective reality, perhaps that was an objective reality then, which has changed now. World politics are changing, have changed quite a lot. The sort of the rise of China, the kind of growth of authoritarianisms, the changing position of the United States, which has, throughout the Cold War looked first to Europe, but again, probably since the late 1990s has turned more towards the Pacific. Perhaps it will prove to be the case that Britain is better off out of the EU. But I think what it leaves is that very, very big question, partly to do with how does Britain best exercise its international influence, but also to do with how do we express British internationalism. So, and I'm sure that conservative Eurosceptics even wouldn't want the legacy of Britain's history. I mean, if I may rather facetiously return to the quote from Sir Ronald Turnbull, I won't say it again out loud, but that sense of what's left behind the legacy of the British, when the British Empire sinks behind the waves of history, what would be left would be the game of association football and a certain phrase which I won't repeat. And that phrase, it's such a wonderful quote because it has this kind of it might just be, again, a statement of reality. Those are things that people associate with Britain, but it has that slightly nationalist edge about it, doesn't it? Again, that kind of, 2 world wars, the World Cup, we're better than the rest of them. And I think what we wouldn't want to see is that being the sort of legacy of Brexit. And hopefully it won't be, but it's got that kind of, that edge to it, or it has had at certain points in the debate, that edge to it. So we need to see where it's going to evolve, where and how it's going to evolve.
As you invoke Fanny Adams at the end of our session, I've run out of time. I'll thank you very much indeed, Helen, for your contribution this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you for attending and watching. Our next event is Thursday, and that is Tales from the Biomedical Frontier, where 3 postgraduate students from the Faculty of Medical Sciences will have the opportunity to share their research. We hope you can join us then.